Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Traci Chernoff, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Thanks so much for being here for another week. This week, I have an incredible guest on, actually, who is going to give us a lot of insight into his book. But I just want to quickly dive into a little bit of like the overview here before I introduce you to Eric. Today's episode is really going to dive us into a book that is as cathartic as it is strategic. It's called Have You Ever Had a Boss That? Succeeding in a Dysfunctional Workplace by Eric Charran. And if you've ever found yourself asking, how did this person get promoted? This episode is for you. We'll explore toxic managerial archetypes, laugh or cry maybe through some real life scenarios, and most importantly, arm you with practical ways, not just to survive, but also thrive. So let's get into it. Eric Charran is a visionary technology executive, author, and thought leader with over 25 years of experience in transforming global enterprises through digital innovation, data-driven strategy, and AI-driven solutions. Known for his ability to bridge the gap between business objectives and complex technology, Eric has spearheaded transformative initiatives at major organizations, including Microsoft and Capital One, where he served as chief architect, bringing substantial advances in cloud resilience, digital transformation, and data infrastructure efficiency. His strategic insights and leadership have driven high-impact changes across sectors, optimizing performance and fostering resilience in industries from finance to healthcare. And in this book that I mentioned, in Have You Ever Had a Boss That?, Eric draws on his extensive leadership experience and his understanding of corporate dynamics to offer readers a guide to navigating workplace challenges, enhancing personal effectiveness, and fostering a balanced, fulfilling career. With insights that resonate across industries, he empowers readers to become more effective leaders and team players, which is something that we all will love for sure to dive into. And with a career shaped by a commitment to measurable impact and a player-coach leadership style, Eric is a sought-after speaker and advisor on topics like leadership, digital innovation, and organizational change, where you'll see his work continue to influence leaders and organizations seeking sustainable, innovative solutions in a rapidly evolving world. Eric, I'm so excited for our conversation today. Thank you so much for joining the podcast and for being here.
Traci, such a generous introduction. Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Of course, of course. Hey, I always like to say, as much as we draft our own bios, sometimes it's really important to hear someone read it back to us, because it's like, you're living your life and you're not necessarily looking back on all of the things that you've accomplished, which is quite abundant. So kudos to you.
Thanks so much. I have to admit to everybody that I certainly had help on that. My publicist did a great job in putting all that together. I don't think I could have penned it as eloquently. I think we tend to underestimate our own impact
I
looking
think you're
back.
right.
So it's kind of nice to have somebody peeking over your shoulder saying that, hey, no, you actually have done some stuff.
Yes, I agree. As I help people with their resumes very often, especially executives, and sometimes people will get hung up on certain words, and I'm like, no, but you're doing that. Like, that adjective is totally relevant. Like, you're doing that, and you're so right. We tend to underestimate ourselves, with the exception of the manager archetypes that we're going to talk about, because they totally overestimate themselves, if
In
you
many
ask
cases,
me.
they do.
Right? Oh my goodness. Well, we have a lot to talk about, so maybe we just jump right in. I mean, of course, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about why dysfunctional workplaces matter and the impact that they have, and how difficult managers impact employee well-being and productivity. So, I mean, we all, I'm sure, have our own personal anecdotes on this, but I'm curious if there was, through your experience, if there was an inspiration for this book, if there was a dysfunctional experience that you had lived through.
Yeah. So I'm a Gen Xer, so I've been around for a while. And when I came out of college and had my first professional job, I had stars in my eyes, like many folks understandably do, and they should. But what I quickly began to realize is that the managers who I reported to, these leaders, these people who I ultimately aspired to be right out of the gates, were flawed individuals that had all sorts of negative and unhelpful behaviors that I was surprised with, just coming out of school, that people could ascend to these levels of leadership, but also have such toxic, and we didn't use that word back then, but such destructive behaviors.
Hmm.
And you kind of just, if I'm kind of remember casting my mind back to kind of my first experiences, you kind of just are like, okay, this is how it is, and I just have to deal with this. There weren't terms like psychological safety back then, or bringing your whole self to work, or culture was just like something that was being thought of purposefully at that time. And so it was either, you put your nose to the grindstone, you deal with your manager's unhelpful behaviors, their reactions, screaming and yelling at you or berating you. Like those were things that were commonplace. And for many leaders, that's how they believe that they got results was, just challenging people, constantly moving the bar in not a great way, but a negative way, and
Hmm.
being very sparing with praise and not coaching but commanding. And so, what was interesting is as I began to work in these types of environments, it became very difficult. And I was actually trying to figure out like why is this person behaving this way, and I can't believe this is happening to me, and it must be me. I must be deficient in some way, and I got to work harder to cover up for all these deficiencies that these managers keep finding. And then I began to realize as I got mid in career or close to middle in career, which I guess is where I am now, is that these behaviors tend to repeat across organizations, across teams, across managers, across individuals. And became very interesting because I'm sitting in a conference room and I'm just stunned at this manager's behavior, and
Hmm.
I'm like, wait a second, I've been here before. I've seen this before. And now I somehow know what to do to kind of navigate through this. It's no longer shock and horror and like, oh my gosh, I can't believe what's happening. Let me get out
Hmm.
of this room. It's, I've seen this before. Let me try to utilize some of the strategies that I've implemented before to navigate through this. So that's kind of how I became to realize that these behaviors kind of repeat. And then, like, I think your question was like around the genesis of the book, like what led me to write this is,
Hmm.
I think as you get to the period I am in my career, you start to look back, you start to have team members full of like, junior and mid-level folks and who are on their own journeys. And you tend to say, like, if they could know what I know, wouldn't it make their lives easier? And that's really where the genesis of the book came from. And it finally came to a head when a couple of my VP colleagues and I were kind of sitting around commiserating about some leaders. And we started kind of just listing out the things that we were, uh, hate's a strong word, but we were challenged with around some of their unhelpful behaviors. And we're like, yeah, I'm like, oh, I've seen this before. And they were like, yeah, I've seen this before too. Here's what I do, and here's what I did to get around this, and here's what they'll do next, and here's what you'll need to do to cope with it. And then we kind of said, somebody said, well, hey, someone should write this stuff down. This is great. And I said, you know what? I'll write it down. And that's how the book came to be.
Wow, amazing. First of all, it's so on the nose because when we think about dysfunctional workplaces, it is pretty like it's pretty predictable in the sense that what creates the dysfunction from a leadership standpoint, these archetypes which we'll go into are pretty like again like predictable and consistent. Like there isn't this like unknown about a leader that's dysfunctional or creates a quote unquote toxic workplace. Like they generally fall into one or more of these kind of categories or archetypes as you kind of call it, which is really fitting considering your career because you probably look at things with a focus on not just like design but also categorizing, like how do we like take a look at these things and fit them into like a build and an understanding of like what can then be replicated. And so with that, like one of the things that I thought about when I was reading especially the first part of the book is that when we ask ourselves how the heck did that person get promoted because they totally suck, that then like sends a message throughout the organization that that's what it takes to be successful. And
Right.
that's when it's just a snowball effect. Then other people start to think, oh well, maybe I just need to be that type of leader in order to achieve the career growth that I'm looking for. I think it's probably more like maybe it's not as celebrated as much, like maybe workplaces are starting to realize that's not what makes someone successful, but still we certainly see this.
That's so insightful because these behaviors, these unhelpful behaviors that I ascribe to archetypes, not the people themselves, are just a function of the wrong tools in their toolbox.
Mm,
And these behaviors and these unhelpful tools persist because almost exactly of what you just said. In many organizations, a promotion is a reward. It's the organization saying that I'm confident that the results that you delivered were fantastic, and I think if we give you a team and we put you in a leadership position, we can achieve a force multiplication effect on your abilities. So congratulations, here you go. And in many instances, having gone through this myself, you're like, wow, look at what I've been able to achieve. And then like the next day or so, you're like, okay, now what do I do?
yeah,
Well, the only frame of reference I have is the leaders who led me.
that's right.
So I often say leaders lead how they were led. And if the leader that you had a toolbox full of unhelpful tools and behaviors, you're like, and as you said, you're like that, well, that must be what it takes to be successful here and to be a leader. So I'm just going to follow suit and do those things. And in reality, what I've noticed is for people, organizations pay a lot of attention to people that are on the executive end of things. So people like myself and others that are managing teams of 500 or 1,000 people, there's a lot of leadership advice, formal training, offsites, and coaching that help people in those positions manage that big of a staff. And it's rightly so, like that managing that number of people or greater is a art form in itself, and it's a much different one than if you were a early in career manager. But what I think is underserved in a lot of organizations is what are some helpful tools that we can give managers before they start just rote adoption of what their managers actually did. I think that that's an underserved area of investment for professional help. And there's this constant obsession now in the corporate environment of hiring bar raisers, hiring people that are fantastic individuals, but bringing them in and the talent acquisition is significantly expensive. And if you assign them to folks, one of the things I had the opportunity when I sat with Satya Nadella as part of a leadership program when I was at Microsoft, one thing that he said that resonated with me is that people don't quit teams or organizations, they quit managers. And if
Totally.
you are acquiring these top tier talented individuals and you're assigning them to people that have a plethora of unhelpful behaviors, those people are going to leave. They're going to look for other opportunities, hopefully within your organization, or most likely outside your organization.
Mm, that's a really, really good point. It makes me think of like how we break the cycle on like toxic leadership, which is kind of a play on breaking the cycle and generational issues, like
Yeah.
socially or familially. But it's interesting how there is that crossover between, you know, your personal life and your professional life in the sense that we can understand like, oh, if we have someone in our family that is maybe toxic, let's say, or
Hmm.
dysfunctional, or is not necessarily adding positively to our experience, or vice versa, we will say, okay, well, I have to cut them out. And similarly, when there's a imbalance between good someone who's representing good behaviors and someone who's representing poor behaviors or dysfunctional behaviors depending on the organization's standards, there isn't a balance there, and so it results in that like push and pull that you're basically describing. And it's so true. I think that people do stay and leave because of leaders, and that it goes both ways. Like if someone wants someone who leads them in a functional way, meaning like opposite of dysfunctional, in a way that's positive and progressive, then they are probably going to respond better when they have a leader who's matching that need for them. Whereas if someone's like, oh, no, 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 I see what makes success, and dysfunction is it, even though they don't see it that way. They're
Right.
not thinking, oh, I'm a dysfunctional member of this team, I'm going to keep doing it. They're just thinking like, this is what it takes to be successful. If they have someone who's trying to help them get to a different place, it's just not going to be a match. And
Hmm.
it's an interesting, like, perplexing place probably for an organization to find themselves in.
Yeah, it's what really resonated with me about what you said is like for those of us that are parents, you often say, "Hey, if I ever have kids, I'm never going to be the same type of parent that my parents were." and you do get a little bit older and you're like, well, hey, they did the best they could with what they knew at the
Yeah.
time. But still, there are things that they did in which you're like, I'm not going to do that. And you tend to soften your your appreciation of what your parents did as you get older. But
Yeah.
you also, I think, with every generation, you become smarter and more knowledge becomes available, and you don't have to handle things the way that your parents did, but you can still achieve the same or better results. It's the
Hmm.
same thing with leadership. You have to, be able to say, listen, I'm in this position and I don't know exactly what to do, but I do know that I didn't enjoy this when I experienced it. And so now I'm going to try to find a different way to do things.
Yes, I love that. That's a wonderful way to put it. And I think this is probably a good opportunity for us to dive into those manager archetypes that we've been talking about. A few memorable ones for me were the surprised, the emergency broadcaster, the firefighter, the raw nerve, and the LIFO, or last in, first out. And so I would love to maybe talk through some of those. Of course, the listeners will have the opportunity to get a copy of your book, of course, but just to kind of go through them, maybe we take a few and like do a little bit of a deep dive. One of the ones that really stood out for me was the emergency broadcaster. And specifically because I think that one is one that's like extremely, it feels to me like it's extremely dysfunctional. And we'll go through it. Obviously, all of these are archetypes of what dysfunctional leadership can look like. For those of you who are maybe not any of these, that might mean that you're not a dysfunctional leader. So don't feel like you have to prescribe to these. Like, you shouldn't, hopefully you're not finding yourself in some of these, but if you are, then that just means that maybe we can give you some solutions to overcoming some of these archetypes. But anyway, the emergency broadcaster is really like this: drop everything, we have a crisis. And it's like this constant panic mode, often disrupting personal time for last minute chaos. Chaos has no place in my life. I can't. I'm always like, I can't. It's chaotic. I can't. I'm backing out. See you later. So, can you walk us through that archetype and where it tends to come up?
Yeah, yeah. I will say before we dive in, I would, as I
Mhm.
was writing this, one of the things that I started to realize is that, hey, you know what? There are some of these in me, even though I'm actually
Mm.
writing down as I'm writing. I'm like, gosh, I hope I'm not this, or maybe I am. Maybe I am the amnesiac. Which is,
I
and
felt
listen,
I felt
it's
that when I was reading. I was like, "Oh God, am I any of these?"
and that's a good stressor, right? To be able to say that with self-awareness that, you know what, I'm not perfect
Hmm.
and I do have some of these things inside me and maybe I need to do something different. But the emergency broadcaster was one I think that we all kind of live through. And I think as you get on in your career, the senior leaders are often underwater, overloaded. These folks are responsible for delivering fiscal results, financial impact to the business. They have hundreds of thousands of emails unread in their inbox, Slack messages just blowing up every day. And in the book, I try to follow a narrative format. And so I try to use characters that we tell the stories about. Each one of these stories happened to me. So in this instance, my manager got a Slack message at 6:30 a.m. That said, "Hey, I'm looking forward to your team's presentation today. This is going to be important for the board to hear." And manager's like, "What? Wait a second, I don't remember that at all." All right, so now I need to bring everybody together to make sure that we're prepared for this. I didn't know that this was going to happen today. And so at that point in time, everybody knows that a vice president's calendar is just jam packed, like days in advance. So the
Hmm.
question becomes, well, when is the only time we can get people together ad hoc? It's obviously before or after hours. So this particular manager I had was a fan of the 7:30 a.m.
Oh
emergency
God.
meeting. People are in Zoom, shaky video on their phones. Their kids are screaming in the back seat as they're being dropped off at daycare. People are getting on and off trains, losing signals in elevators, juggling their phone with their Starbucks cups, trying to get to the office.
Hmm.
And it's all about like, okay, who's on deck? What do we have to do? I'm going to need you to do this, Eric, or I'm going to need you to do this, so and so. And in many instances, we were like, yeah, we've known about this for months. We're prepared. We sent you the deck last week. And it's like, well, let me see this. Let's go through it right now, slide by slide. And eventually you take from that 7:30 to your 9 a.m. Now you have no time to prepare for your own 9 a.m.s because you are, you know, kind of scaling up and, kind of take the emergency out of this particular manager's, awareness. And so that becomes, and by the way, throughout the day, it kind of resurges. Lunchtime, where I have questions about this. I don't think this slide belongs here, and then starts the deconstruction of a very well thought
Mm-hmm.
out and put together presentation that everybody's worked on. And at the last minute, you are running into the meeting, editing slides on the fly, disrupting very well thought out plans and presentations, and then making the overall stress of your employees and the presentation and the work suffers.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the emergency broadcaster. But
Mm-hmm.
what's important is to really realize that if they had a choice, and many of these archetypes, if people had a choice to say, yes, I behave that way, or no, I'm not going to, they would say, gosh, no, I don't want to behave that way.
Right.
But it's the only thing that they know how to do because of all of the different motivations and pressures that they're under. So it's very difficult as your kids are screaming and you're on a 7:30 a.m. call to feel empathy for somebody that orchestrated that chaos. But in order
Mm-hmm.
for you to actually get through it, to cope with it, you have to put yourself in their shoes. So certainly experience the shock, horror, and awe and, just resentment. Let it wash over you as best you can, and then get into a position where you're like, all right, well, how can I prevent the next one? How can I actually work with my manager to say that, hey, you know what? We are going to have this presentation. I'm worried that you haven't opened the deck. I'm worried that it's lost in your inbox. How can I actually get this in front of you so that you're aware, we can get your feedback so that we all walk in together, practiced and polished?
Mm. This, I'm telling you, this one, it was taking me back. It took me back to some times in my career, especially with some retail leaders that I've worked with. But honestly, it's like across every industry. This is not
Hmm.
specific to any industry. It really took me back because I can remember feeling not only infuriated, but the stress that it caused, like when I had an emergency broadcaster archetype who I worked
Hmm.
for. And one of the things that I think you articulated really perfectly is like the how to cope with. Because earlier on in my career, I would just find myself getting infuriated and I would be like, this person has a lot of nerve doing this to me when I put all of
Hmm.
this effort into something really good. And then you kind of like unpack it personally. But
Right.
to your point, in order to cope with it in a way that's more positive and more productive is to really think about, okay, what did that person go through that created that like sense of chaos for them. And something that I talk about often, not only in my own professional life but also on this podcast, are really two things. One, that when people have an inflammatory response, be the anti-inflammatory, be the NSAID
Hmm.
in this case.
That's
Like
right.
when someone is acting that way, do your best to de-emphasize whatever is causing that chaos. So like in that situation, now knowing what I know now 10 plus years later in my career, I would say, hey, let's slow down. We put a lot of effort into this. We met a ton of times. Like, why don't we just go through it? Why? And as a matter of fact, if in many cases, what ends up happening, I feel like, is that leader of the department brings in all of the levels.
Hmm.
And rather than, like leveraging or leaning into their next level leader who can then kind of protect the rest of the team from that type of chaos, it's just like everybody feels it. So I would say that anti-inflammatory there is like, hey, why don't we just meet offline? Like the
Right.
team put a lot of good work into this. Like, let's just meet. It's a lot easier than like disrupting 10 people's days, so to speak. And then the other thing that I talk about often is managing up. And it's kind of this,
Hmm.
it's a less tangible example of like this anti-inflammatory analogy that I use. But when you manage up and to your point, when you think about how you prevent that from happening again, to me, there's like a closing the loop on feedback, and
Hmm.
there's a how do I manage my manager so that they
Yes.
don't annoy me again and they don't disrupt my day the way they did
Yeah.
in that moment.
Uh, 100%. Managing up is actually a lot of the advice that I give, and I actually
Hmm.
talk about how to do it diplomatically without engaging in CLMs, as we used to call them, career limiting moves. But what's that saying that people say when couples break up? It's not you, it's me.
Yeah.
It's the reverse. It's not you, it's them, right?
Hmm.
They are the ones in many cases, right? Not all of them, but in many cases, these behaviors have nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with them and the pressures that they're under and the stress involved in walking in their shoes. But you are 100% right in that managing up is a skill that is an absolute necessity. The question becomes, how do I do that? And that's really what I talk through in the book, not just by telling people what I think made me successful, but how you can actually do it through illustrative examples. But one of the things that I think early in career folks are often challenged by is the concept of managing up. These people are kind of like the Avengers or the Justice League, right? Like they have been anointed and by the organization with these powerful positions of leadership and influence, and you are at the other end of that. You're 1 to 2 years in, you're maybe a few months in, and you're like, well, there's obviously I need to learn. The learning goes one way here, and that means that whatever they do, I need to learn from. There's not anything that I could possibly teach this person, which is 100% false. Everybody can learn from everybody, and having a growth mindset enough to realize that is what's super important. The other thing is you have to be able to not descend into what I call like the negative spiral. So I'm sure for those of us that have been around for a while, you just everything just becomes a self-enforcing prophecy in which the world is out to get you. And I often tell people like if you seek negativity, seek an instance where somebody's against you, you'll find it. Whether it's
Hmm.
real or not, you'll find it.
Totally.
But if you make the choice, and this is on the non-clinical end of things, of course, if you
Okay.
make the choice to be positive and you say that not what do I have to do today? What do I get to do today? What's in my ability to influence and control? That has put you in a much better mindset so that you can approach these reverent figures. And these people have our economic and our career potential in their hands. But that doesn't mean that you can't gently steer and guide them to grow as along with you. So they're on their own journey as well. And so it is fully within the realm of your capability to say, listen, I think there's a smarter way to do this. The key is, though, getting them to a position where they're willing to hear your advice. I
Hmm.
often say that being right is maybe like 50% of the battle. The other 50% is emotionally identifying with the person so that they feel that you understand and so that they are in a position to accept your advice. I've been at the other end of that. I have a howitzer full of data and examples of how you're about to run this team off a cliff, and I'm 100% right. But if they are not interested in hearing that, they are going to bind to the emotion that they used in making the decision. They will go deeper, and
Hmm.
they will tune out any logic or data associated with the opposing view.
Yeah, protect your peace, folks. I mean, I think this is something that I've kind of learned this the hard way, frankly. I would invest so much energy into like as an HR partner saying, "Hey, we've got to do things differently. This was not okay." And taking the I'm right approach first rather than how are you, like, where did this come from, asking questions, why did you make this decision, why did you react that way, to build that kind of the to your point, like that connection based on trust and understanding. And I
Hmm.
learned the hard way, and if it wasn't like, oh, I learned it once and then like I applied a different practice. I had to like learn it a few times before realizing, or go through it a few times before realizing, oh, wait a second, if someone just told me that, or just came to me and was like, oh, you didn't do this the right way, like these are all the things that you caused, I wouldn't
Hmm.
be so thrilled either. So it's like, how do you, even if you have great relationships with people, it doesn't mean that they're going to be open immediately just because of that. So building the rapport, to your point, where you create you like allow them to drop their guard, and you create an environment where openness is felt and appreciated, then it's much easier to share your feedback or your advice without it coming off like you know better and that they know worse and that they've done a poor job, even if that is the case. And I'm glad I learned that. But I think that this is where, like, with this podcast, for example, if we can teach people in a way where they don't have to learn the hard way. We're gonna cut right to the chase, like, so much faster. And I actually had a leader who would say to me, "Hey, if you don't have to spend years learning this and you can just like take what I'm saying and apply it, you're going to save yourself a lot of headaches." And so now,
Yeah.
you know, that really helped me to think about, oh, like, I'd rather not learn the hard way actually. Like, let me figure out what I can do differently so that I'm not like constantly faced with this uphill battle where, to your point, when someone has an emotional reaction, you are being dragged down into this deep, deep hole. And you're like, wait, how did we get here? But it's like
Right.
you kind of contributed to that because you didn't think, you know, 5 steps ahead into what this person's reaction would be and avoiding that whole spiral.
Yeah, you're so right. It's the way I think about it is you achieve understanding through empathy, and then you can convince somebody of
Right.
something. And that's
Right.
that's really the thread that runs through the entire book.
Yeah, it's so true. And I like the narrative approach that you take because of that. It's like, oh yeah, I had a leader that was kind of like that. They did something similar. And then when you get to that second part of the book where you really talk about the coping skills and building resilience and growing your manager, which is what we're really
Hmm.
talking about here and managing up, as a career skill, it's like, oh wait, yeah, there are things that are in my control, as a matter of fact, that
Hmm.
can improve or reduce the chaos or the dysfunction or the that feeling of stress that the receiving party, so to speak, or that I, in this case, or someone else, is feeling as a result of some of these more dysfunctional archetypes. And then one of the other archetypes that really stood out to me was the surprised. I think, you
Yeah.
know, of course, these are probably some of the more common ones. Considering, I mean, I've actually, there's some archetypes that I've never experienced. Like, for example, the last and first out, I've never experienced that.
Hmm.
However, the surprised, I definitely have. The like, why am I just hearing about this now? Like, always being blindsided. And you're like, what are you talking about? I sent you like 3,000 emails about this. You confirmed receipt. We talked about this in our one on one the other day. Why are you wasting my time? That's the emotional response that at
That's
least
right.
I've had before. Um, ultimately, like, the impact is that it undermines the team's trust. And it's just like it creates all of these breakdowns. And then there's like this blame game, and it's this whole thing. And one of the, or two of the coping strategies that I really liked that you shared were the proactive verbal communication followed by documentation. And this is a great example of managing up because we know that, especially as HR partners, we encourage managers to do that with
Hmm.
their teams. So when you flip it and you're the team member managing up, and you talk it out with the person, this is the proactive verbal communication followed by the write it down or documentation approach, then you are proactive about preventing something like that in the future. And it's very easy to just like forward an email and say, see, we talked about this, like, you want to take some time to review it before we meet, you know. And then it
Right.
kind of keeps you not in the driver's seat, but it keeps you in the position where you can not feel so out of control.
That's exactly right. Like when I was writing this, and I had a couple of executive colleagues of mine kind of read this. They're like, "This is like being in an Uber with your family, and the driver just at the stoplight gets out of the car and leaves, and you're all in the car, and you're like,
Like, what
wait."
the hell's going on?
That's really what the surprise manager archetype makes you feel like from a team perspective and working for this individual. And you're 100% right. It's like, how can you not know this? How can you? And the answer is, again, they are under extreme pressure. They could have personal things going on in their
Right.
lives that's upsetting the apple cart. And it's that empathy and then these techniques that you can use to manage up. The one thing I will say is that for all these archetypes, it's very important to diplomatically inform your manager that these behaviors are impacting the team in not so terrific ways. And that I think together, what we can do is X, Y, and Z. After you've empathized, after you've got them to a point where they're willing to listen, then you can say, listen, this is not the best for the team. And any manager is going to be interested in making sure that the team is happy. And that's certainly altruistically important, but it's also because in many organizations, they do these pulse surveys in which manager compensation is based on how well you are rated by your team. So there's a financial, fiscal, and career interest in managers making sure that the team is happy with the jobs that they're doing in their leadership. So
Hmm.
those two things are kind of critical in making sure that you find the right way to dispel some of these behaviors which persist in silence from leader to leader.
Totally, totally. Um, when I think about the surprised archetype, and I think I want to make sure we also get to some of the takeaways because I could talk about these archetypes probably for another 40 minutes, just because it's really so fascinating. And when I think about the surprised archetype, it's there is an element here where I think when we think about like the emotional reaction that that causes for someone who's extremely um committed and highly responsible, it feels like their work doesn't matter. It
Right.
feels like they put in hours of effort, all of this energy for someone not to notice.
Yeah.
And certainly there are members of the team who really just don't care and they're like, "Eh, whatever, like I'll just kick the can down the road." And we know that this is also an archetype where you're like, "Ah, we'll deal with it when it's on fire."
Hmm.
Um but I think like especially considering there are when we think about larger teams or frankly, I guess it's really applicable to smaller teams too, where you might have people who are really focused on their career growth. That
Hmm.
is so impactful. And when we think about going back to your point that people stay and leave for managers, if they consistently have that type of manager leading them and maybe they're newer in their career and they haven't developed those coping skills yet, they're out. They're
That's
not
right.
staying because they're like, "Oh, well, you don't feel any commitment or responsibility to me. You don't actually care what I'm doing, even if that's not the case."
Right.
But that's the emotional response. And so rather than coping with it and making improvements to prevent it in the future, they just leave and they find a different place.
Yeah, there's this unwritten contract, I think, between a manager and employees that the manager should amplify and provide visibility to a team's great work, whether that's individual team members, or it's the team as a whole. Your job is to have your team members stand on your shoulders and then be able to kind of help you push them up. And when that doesn't happen, like you said, career-minded individuals that are focused on career velocity are going to say, not only am I dissatisfied with these unhelpful behaviors and these archetypical challenges, I don't actually find it interesting to stay here because this person is not amplifying my efforts. And in fact, they're doing the opposite. They're constantly switching things, like in the LIFO case, which is the last thing
Mhm.
that that manager hears becomes the most important thing that the team does. Drop everything else. And the people are kind of like, what? This was going to be something that was going to be impactful, something that was going to deliver results. And now you're telling me that I have to switch to this thing? And listen, that happens in business.
Mhm.
But at the same time, if it happens every time there's an executive meeting, then it becomes something that's more fatiguing, right? And you
Totally.
don't get that opportunity to deliver things and to be amplified.
Totally, totally. With that, I think I'm sure that there are listeners who are like, "Oh man, I have to read this book because my manager falls into one of these." What are some takeaways that people can walk away with? Like, of course, there's part of this which is like identifying what archetype their leader might fall into if they are dysfunctional, or even maybe some of the opportunities that their leader has might fall into and like they
Yeah.
might be a great leader but they might have, we all are not perfect as we've talked about, but it's like of course I'm sure there's part of that is identifying what that looks like. But in terms of like really being able to apply coping strategies, like what would your recommendation be for listeners who really want to have an actionable takeaway?
Yeah, I think there's two lenses that I think about the answering that question through. The first is if you are a leader and you are in charge of folks and you do have to deliver results and you are underwater in terms of communication and what you have to work on and what you have to deliver, definitely read through the book through the lens of like, am I, is this me in some element? And if it is, then say, you know what, I need to own up to that, and this is how it impacts people, and I need to get better at it, and this is the strategies that I can use to get better at those things, while at the same time utilizing these very strategies to manage upwards. If you are somebody that's subject to some of these archetypes, the interesting thing to realize is that it's not has very it probably has very little to do with you as a person, even though it feels that way, or you as a professional. It has everything to do with them and the stresses that they're under. Achieve understanding through empathy so that you can grow your manager, that you can utilize these techniques to provide a preparedness to, like you said, I like your the phrase you used earlier, protect your peace. That's super
Hmm.
important. But ultimately, you're going to reach a tipping point where you might recognize that even though you're trying to implement all of these important strategies and they're the exact right thing to do, you're doing the exact right way, it's just not being effective, or it's just not being effective in a time frame that you're willing to invest in.
Mm.
So to that, to folks in that situation, I say know your worth. Make sure that you understand that when it is time to leave, that you do so not running from a situation, but looking towards additional opportunities. And knowing your worth, meaning that, not necessarily financially, although that's important, but knowing your worth
Mhm.
and what you're capable of doing and what your talent is, and that you can say, listen, I'm going to make a conscious choice to look for something because I'm going to leave this manager. That's super important.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for that. I think it's totally relevant, and hopefully the listeners will really feel inspired by looking at these things with a less inflammatory response, because we all can be inflamed by these things.
Hmm.
And in terms of where listeners can find the book, of course, we'll link everything, but where could they pick up a copy of your book and start to break down how they are as leaders, or maybe some things that they want to ensure they are paying attention to, or how they can apply some of those coping strategies that you've talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. From a logistical perspective, it's available on Amazon, of course. Have you ever had a boss that? It's available at all major booksellers and retailers. If you don't see it, ask for it. It's either there or they can get it for you. Love to hear what folks have to say about it, and really looking forward to understanding if it helps people. From what I've heard so far, people are gravitating towards the archetypes and the coping strategies. And what I really tried to do is to write it in a way in which I demonstrate how the coping strategies can be implemented through a narrative frame, and then what the potential results can be. But ultimately, my hope is that people walk away from this feeling empowered, feeling that they are not subject to these behaviors, that they can observe them and respond to them and grow their managers.
Amazing. Well, Eric, thank you so much for not only writing this book, but also for sharing your insights on my podcast this week. I think it's going to make a huge impact. Dysfunction in workplaces is something that I am DM'd and emailed about constantly. So I think that this will really help to give people solutions and kind of give them a little bit of control back in their lives, which always feels good for anyone. So
Excellent.
for
Tracy, thanks for
yeah.
having me on.
Of course. Thank you so much. And for the listeners, you'll find everything in the show notes. You can click links very easily there. Eric, thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to this show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.